Fields from KTVB, and we welcome you again to Ed Sessions 2.0 Lunchtime Speaker Series. As you know, it's a monthly education forum featuring nationally recognized speakers from across the nation who are insiders and outsiders or outsiders that have something important to say about education in America. The Ed Sessions 2.0 is the evolution of the popular and powerful Ed Sessions series hosted at the Egyptian Theater and featured speakers Sir Ken Robinson, Mike Rowe, and Sal Khan. The purpose of Ed Sessions is to elevate the conversation about what is possible in education in Idaho, to learn from national experts about what is working in education and what is not, and to help us understand the best way to make improvements in our schools. Ed Sessions 2.0 is brought to you by the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation in partnership with KTVB, Idaho Technology Council, Idaho State Board of Education, Idaho Association of School Administrators, Idaho Business for Education, Idaho School Boards Association, who is our host partner this month. The ISBA is led by Karen Echevarria. Did I pronounce that correctly? Close. Let me try it one more time. Karen Echevarria. There we go. All right. See, we're all learning, right? This is the process of education. All right, now I'd like to talk about our nonprofit of the month. Each month, Ed Sessions will feature a different education-related nonprofit who contributes to the Albertsons Foundation vision of limitless learning for all Idahoans. This month, we are highlighting the Treasure Valley Education Partnership. And I would like to introduce Nora Carpenter, new Executive Director of the Treasure Valley United Way, which provides support and oversight for TVEP. Nora, would you like to stand and just kind of wave to everyone? Hello. And Rich Raimondi is Chair of TVEP as well. Rich, would you like to stand up? And as you can see, this venue is very cozy and can only accommodate a limited number of people. There's a reason for this. We want this venue to be small enough for people to interact with each other and the speakers, but we don't want to leave anybody out. So we're video casting all the Ed Sessions 2.0 hot lunches. So welcome to those of you who are watching via ktvb.com and Ed Sessions Facebook page. Remember, webcast viewers can post questions on the Ed Sessions Facebook page anytime during this presentation, so we'd love to hear from you. Whatever you want to call it, education reform, school redesign, school improvement, system reform, it is a controversial topic no matter where you stand. All our speakers are nationally known and respected, but you may or may not support their position on a specific topic. The J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation thinks that challenging the current thinking is good for Idaho students. And because this is about our kids, we know this can be a very emotional subject. As we've said before, we promise hot topics over a hot lunch, but we don't want hot tempers. We do want civil discussions that are rooted in respect for one another and our guest speakers. So you probably saw the ground rules on the screen. We'll run through them very quickly once again. Respect is expected and personal attacks are not. We can agree to disagree. If you have a question to ask, please write it down on the cards that are provided for you at your table and hand it to someone with a blue name tag. We have Megan, Rachel, and Blossom. They'll be kind of wandering around to grab those questions from you. So I would like to introduce our speaker, Joe Williams. Joe Williams has built a reputation as one of the most effective strategists and coalition builders in the education reform community. He is a nationally recognized analyst and public speaker on education policy and politics, reaching thousands of listeners in audiences from coast to coast each year. Joe is also one of the most prolific writers and commentators in the education reform world, often tapping into his experience as a newspaper reporter and author to make the case for reform. He previously worked as an award-winning education journalist for the New York Daily News and Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. He has written extensively on education politics nationally and has served as a non-resident senior fellow for the Washington-based think tank Education Sector. He is author of the book, Cheating Our Kids: How Politics and Greed Ruin Education. Joe lives in New York City, where his children attend the city's public schools. Please join me in welcoming Joe. I'm jumping the gun. Rich, would you like to come up, please? My apologies. Joe, we'll wait to hear from you in a minute.
Thanks, Kim. I'm not Joe Williams, so I'll make this quick because that's who you came to hear. What I'd like to do is give you just a couple of minutes outlining what the Treasure Valley Education Partnership is all about, how it got started, what we're focused on, and the number of people and organizations that have come together in what we believe is an unprecedented collaboration amongst key stakeholders in education here in the Treasure Valley. Next slide. So how did this happen? We, as about beginning of 2011, we, amongst many other people in this state, saw there was a significant opportunity to improve where we were at. We also knew that looking out in the future, that the jobs that would be created in the next 8 years, at that time 9 years, were going to require some form of post-secondary career certificate, college degree, or something of the sort. While we were doing a pretty good job in the Treasure Valley of graduating people, young people from high school, we weren't doing a very good job of them going on, and even worse job if you look at the data of actually completing college within 6 years. So we set forth starting with the superintendents of the Treasure Valley school districts, including Bishop Kelly, where I serve as a president, and the 10 other school districts in the valley, said, how do we help this situation while everything's going on at the State House and other places? What can we do working with the business community in the Treasure Valley and nonprofits by coming together in a way that could be really meaningful and start to move the dial on those metrics that I showed you earlier. We now have about 200 different organizations, about 30 members of our core leadership team representing with our superintendents over 150,000 students and youth throughout the valley. We've said we don't want to just focus on K through 12 or post-secondary. We really have to look at what we call a cradle to career continuum. And we picked up a framework from an organization that started in Cincinnati called Strive. And they're now in over 80 communities around the country with places like Seattle, Portland, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati as bellwethers for us to look at and learn from. And it's really a grassroots approach. It's not a tops-down, here we're going to wait for what the state wants to do or other places, but we're going to work hard on making sure we can do the things in the valley of getting all the great people working hard to improve education. How do we get them mobilized and aligned and engaged in a different way? We've also focused, we know that this is something we're going to make step-by-step progress on, and so a continuous improvement process and framework has been key. Our goal really basically is to coordinate and mobilize and engage the area's existing resources and institutions so we can ensure not just 60% go on, but we want 60% to have degrees of the population between 25 and 34, which is a goal we all share. We set a higher bar of 80% than the state has set that can go on to some sort of post-secondary career, technical, or college education. Our mission, quite simply, is to have this be a collaboration we think is unprecedented in this region, and we want to do that in a way that leads all students to their career of choice, not just to a job, but how do we focus on their career of choice and where they wish to go, not just where they can get a job. And we believe it's every child, every step of the way, cradle to career. That's our vision. We don't want anybody left behind. Every child, as our friend Jim Everett, who's on our core leadership team, would say, every child is a promise, and how do we make sure that happens, cradle to career? We have 6 areas of focus within the Treasure Valley Education Partnership. We're focused on making sure kids are prepared for school, they're supported inside and outside of school, that they succeed academically in K through 12 when they're there, that they enroll in and complete some form of secondary post-high school education, they enter their career of choice, and then we added one different than what some of the other areas around the country in the Strive Network have, that they have the opportunity to be supported through meaningful career progression. I myself spent 30 years at HP, failed retirement, came back to work at Bishop Kelly in education, and many of you have stories. It's not going to be typical for this generation coming up to have one job, one company, 30 years and then retire. So we think it's critical we also think about what's going on beyond that. We've also had the benefit of much community support. I mentioned over 200 different organizations are engaged and involved. We're focusing our efforts around those 6 goal areas and actually forming network teams in 3 or 4 of them to get started, because that's how we bring all the resources that are currently doing good work, but how do we mobilize, align, and engage them together. We've also had the good fortune to have JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and the Wharton Foundation and other companies actually not only bring people to the table, but bring funds, so we have a sustainable organization. And so to think through what we've done when we reflect on the first real year, last year of when we organized, we think we accomplished 3 things. One is we built an organizational foundation for TVIP with the support of the United Way of Treasure Valley as a backbone. We've got now 2 not quite full-time, part-time, but 30 hours a week, and they'd say they work more than full-time. Sitting here, Sarah and Melissa are here in the front. So having that organizational backbone, thank you to the Treasure Valley United Way for stepping up and being that. We built a large cross-section of stakeholders who are meeting on a regular basis. The core leadership team monthly, the advisory board, which is a couple hundred people from the community come together to give us feedback. And we've got, again, education people, business and nonprofits all at the table working. And finally, we've got traction in 4 areas that we think are going to be critical. One is early education. How do we make sure kids are prepared for school, succeed academically K through 12? How do we help that transition from high school into college, and then support youth outside of school so that we have kids that continue to learn and continue to be engaged. We've also, in that time, built a community level report card. We have about 6 metrics we've aligned around, not just going on to some form of post-secondary, but completion rates within 6 years, or readiness for kindergarten, 3rd and 8th grade, math and language capabilities, and not just competent, but we want them to be advanced. And so we've set those metrics and started to gather data for these 11 school districts that I mentioned. Our goals next year are threefold also. One is to work with the Strive National to really get these network teams we've got in place up and running and contributing and making a difference, and working with data. We think the facts are going to be critical in how we drive going forward, to make sure we work with other initiatives around the region and the state, whether that be the Idaho Business for Education, the IBE, Idaho Leads, the Governor's Task Force. So we're working in partnership with those and not having isolated efforts. And finally, how do we formalize a structure and increase the capacity to support the work that our partners are doing and that we believe is going to make a difference here in the Treasure Valley. So thanks for the opportunity to be supported here at this event today, and for the chance to speak on behalf of my colleagues who have worked so hard over the last year. I'll applaud in particular the superintendents of the Treasure Valley, many of whom, all of you who are here today, Linda, Don, and I saw Wayne, you'd all stand to be recognized for your work in taking the initiative to work with the business community and other nonprofits to step forward and lead out on the Treasure Valley Education Partnership supported by IBE and the United Way. So would you all stand, the superintendents who are here? Okay. Now you get to hear from Joe Williams. So welcome, Joe.
Rich, appreciate it. Thank you all for being here today for this lunch. And thank you to the Albertson Foundation, not only for obviously inviting me to come here to talk to you all, but for taking on the responsibility of having these discussions at all. I happen to believe that what gets discussed in the public square is of great importance in education. And it's great to have this many opportunities for you all to come together and have these kind of discussions. I realize that there are many people in this room for whom the idea that a group, Democrats for Education Reform, may exist just seems bizarre, almost like I came in from outer space and I'm telling you about a planet that's not the one that you live on. I wanted to just take a few minutes of my time to talk to actually show a quick video to sort of establish my own cred and convince you that there are Democrats for Education Reform on this planet. And then I'll go from there. I'll try to make a few remarks about the overview of what's happening in education politics around the country, and then do that as quickly as I can so we can get to your questions and make this into a discussion. But if you could cue up the video.
Offering our children an outstanding education is one of our most fundamental, perhaps our most fundamental obligation as a country. And whether we meet that obligation not only reflects who we are as Americans, it will shape our future as a nation. And countries that out-educate us today will outcompete us tomorrow, and I refuse to let that happen on my watch.
We now in America have dropped from the #1 country in the globe, the top country in the nation, for percentage of our population that's college graduates. We've gone not to #3, not to #5, we're #9 and falling. This is crazy because you can't drive a 21st century knowledge-based economy on a population that's not being sourced and nurtured and empowered educationally. It's our greatest national security issue because if we fail to really confront this issue, we will see our nation decline.
In the midst of the worst economic crisis that I think we have all seen, every conversation goes back to one critical thing, and that's education. This impacts all of us, and it's really a selfish fight that we take on. This is not about one street, this is not about one city, and it's not about one state. This is a fight that we have to take on across the United States.
In New York, we're operating under the agrarian school calendar from 1880. There aren't any fields to plow, as there were 130 years ago. So why are we still using the same education calendar? This system needs to be eradicated.
I think it was Albert Einstein who once said doing the same thing over and over again and thinking that you're going to get a different result is insanity. Well, we can no longer afford to operate insanity in this country. About 55% of the schools in the city of Cleveland right now are either an academic emergency or academic watch. That is unacceptable. It is immoral.
For Indianapolis Public Schools, we were known nationally as having some of the worst dropout factories. So, we have a big challenge because we have a huge gap, and the things that we're doing right now are not filling that gap quickly enough. So we have to really focus on teacher quality. We have to focus on holding our schools accountable. We have to get everyone pulling in the same direction. It's a crisis, and we need to recognize it for what it is.
She has straight A's, and she needs to stay on that track.
We've come to a moment in time in our history, in this nation, and certainly in Denver, Colorado, where we can no longer do the same thing over and over again and expect our children to meet the grade necessary in order to compete.
How you doing? Welcome to school.
We've got to do radical things. We've got to make sure we're very intentional about bringing quality programs in there.
Public education is the fundamental building block of democracy. And so people passionately care about how their children are educated. To make change within that system is inherently difficult. You have powers in place and people in power that have been around for a long time and are comfortable in the way things are. Some of those things are great. Some of them work well. Some of them don't. We know that all kids don't have access to opportunity. And so a Democrat who believes in education reform is somebody that's willing to say, we can do it better, and it's okay that we do things differently. It's hard to do it, but it's imperative that we take the effort and make sure that it happens.
So this is going to be how we line up. We're going to be called by our tables. And when your whole table is...
It's clear that doing the same old things will not get the job done for our kids. So when I took office, I asked Arne Duncan to work with states and local school districts to take on business as usual in our education system. And that's how the Race to the Top competition was born last July. It's a national competition among states to improve our schools.
The race to the top really raised the eyebrows of a lot of Democrats that couldn't believe that President Obama would be with this. But he had a Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, who was a spectacular educator and a real creative thinker.
President Obama's leadership on education reform issues are critical because it brings legitimacy to the work that progressive education reformers are doing. It used to be heretical for a Democrat to talk about charter schools and to talk about school choice. Most people don't realize President Obama was a trailblazer on this issue long before he actually became President of the United States. He served on the board of a charter school. Charter schools were initially a progressive idea. It was then grabbed by groups who didn't share our values. And their principles were to defund public education. And that became the predominant theme in education reform. DFER changed the conversation and changed it in a way where people saw that you could have a talk about education reform that wasn't anti-public school, but pro-public school. and pro-public education.
Giovanni is definitely being a star, and I really like how Giovanni is standing up straight. Well, you guys, I think you definitely have shown me that you know how to do on your mark.
The biggest variable that makes the greatest impact is a teacher. It is where we all come from. Before there were presidents of the United States and senators and you and I, there were teachers who molded us into the next generation. And so I'm recognizing that we have to kind of take a look back at the profession, create a system that evaluates, respects, supports, and nurtures, and that at the end of the day, when we do that, our students are the ones that win.
If you have teacher evaluation with kind of high stakes evaluation and you don't provide support, then it's punitive. You know, and if you do provide support, it's transformative.
I helped bring DFER to Indiana because there were a lot of Democrats who felt the same way I did, but there was kind of no forum or structure for us to come together, kind of put out a united front, just kind of being there as an advocacy organization.
Be able to walk to school? Really? Yeah, we walk to school.
In the 2011 session, we were able to actually get through quite an ambitious ed reform agenda. We have started to intervene in failing schools. So the state of Indiana is actually, taking charge, taking those schools and saying we're not going to have kids in these kinds of places anymore in this state.
Students at Green Valley Elementary School are reading better, doing math better, they are writing better, and they are ready. They are ready to win. Will you join me in doing that? Huh?
We had young people in our cities, particularly in the neighborhood that I represented, that had absolutely no choice but to go to the institutions that were there, provide an education for them, and they were failing them. And so as a member of the Denver City Council at the time, I helped lead an effort to reform a group of schools in one area, the far northeast area of the city. There was some pushback, but we were not going to be denied because we were not going to allow for these people who wanted to keep the status quo to continue to keep these kids locked into a system that did not give them choice or opportunity to get ready to compete.
And this is not about the comfort or vilification of any adult, but it is about us accepting the reality that the traditional way that we're educating children is failing. And that's why organizations such as DFER are important, because it gives us the strength and the support that we need as Democrats to stand up for reform. Reform is good for children, but it's also good for adults. We've lost over 30,000 students over the last decade in the city of Cleveland for the Cleveland schools. With less students, that means we'll have less teachers, less union members. How could that be good for anybody?
We are in the state we are right now because of a severe poverty of compassion, a poverty of urgency. We have to have a greater sense of outrage, of urgency, of insistence that whatever it takes, we will make this nation true. We will make it real. And the way to do that is by making sure that every child has opportunity to enter an educational environment that will nurture their genius.
Before I became a Maryland State Senator, I was a teacher in Southwest Baltimore City. What I believe is that I saw hope in my classroom. I saw kids who wanted access to a great education. That's where we start, that's where we focus, and we figure out how do we provide that for them. If we can set up those systems, our future is so bright. If we fail, the consequences are disastrous.
Being a Democrat for education reform simply means that I am a Democrat who's determined to change islands of excellence to hemispheres of hope. And so for me, a Democrat for education reform is a person that has no excuses, has higher standards for our kids, believes, I always joke, sort of like Malcolm X, that by any means necessary, we're going to get there, and that we shouldn't accept barriers to that goal.
I think that a Democrat for education reform looks like me, looks like you, looks like the PTA parent, looks like the grandmother who's raising their grandkids at home. I think it means to recognize that we're part of a link in a community chain, that if we all don't take on this fight, that we all lose at the end.
I am Indiana Representative Mary Ann Sullivan, and I am a DFER.
I'm former Colorado Speaker of the House, Terrence Carroll, and I'm a DFER.
I am New Jersey State Senator Teresa Ruiz, y yo soy una DFER.
I'm Michael Hancock, Mayor of the great city of Denver, Colorado, and I'm a DFER.
I'm Maryland State Senator Bill Ferguson, and I am a DFER.
I am State Senator Nina Turner, and I am a DFER.
I'm David Patterson of New York. I used to be the governor. but I am still a defer.
I'm Mayor Cory Booker, and I am a Democrat for education reform.
So my intentions today, I'm not here, thank you for that. I'm not trying to convert people today. I don't get a magazine subscription for every Republican I can flip to a Democrat. Don't worry. I come in peace as a friend to discuss some of this stuff. What I really wanted to convey is that a lot of times we tend to think about education reform and the politics of education reform as sort of a black and white issue. And like you all know from working in education, education, the gray area is where everything happens, and it's also where things get interesting. And I wanted to sort of give you a lay of the land from across the country about the way the politics are shaking out, and really emphasize the gray area, because there's some interesting things that are happening on both the Democratic and Republican sides on this. And if you think back to how we started to think about the black and white aspect of education politics, one that Democratic politics generally surrounded, or the perception that they support the status quo, while Republicans were hard-charging, pushing for change. A lot of it goes back to the 1970s, at a time when I was a public school student, when teacher unions really started to benefit from the organization and ground game that they had established after they began to push for collective bargaining and to really get engaged in mobilizing their members to support candidates for office. So if you remember, when Jimmy Carter became president, he made the Department of Education a cabinet-level position, where the Secretary of Education was actually going to be a Secretary of Education, rather than a commissioner of education, as it had been. And that was in large part because the teacher unions which helped Jimmy Carter get elected president, asked him to make public education a priority for the administration. And so the department was expanded, the secretary's spot was created, and so began a debate which continues to this day about whether or not the Department of Education in Washington should even exist at all. At the same time, so you have the Democrats sort of standing up as the standard bearers for the education lobby for public education. A few years later, during the Reagan administration, sort of tied to the Cold War era, the nation began to look at international competitiveness issues. And in 1983, when the Nation at Risk report came out, which warned that America's schools, the phrase was, are becoming mired in a rising tide of mediocrity. The sort of Republican brand tended to be the things aren't working, we need to push change. That's the black and white part. It was always more complicated than that, including on the teacher union side and the work they were doing with Democrats. So when that report came out in 1983, Al Shanker, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, actually leaned right in and said, this is right. There is a problem in our nation's schools. And I think his perception was that if teacher unions needed to be at the table in discussions about what to do about the problem, he was going to make sure that they were relevant. At the same time, on the Democratic side, we're seeing growing sort of fissures in the belief that everything was okay. We were starting to see community-based groups that were working with at-risk students, and the kind of folks in a lot of cities where I was working in Milwaukee at the time were considered, in some cases, far leftists. One guy who was basically a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party who started to argue that the Milwaukee public schools weren't doing enough for kids who were slipping through the cracks, and launched what became in the 90s in Milwaukee a sort of left-right coalition which brought private school choice and vouchers to the state of Wisconsin. We also started to see civil rights groups worried that low-income and minority students were sort of being ignored in some of the broad discussions about how great public education was. And questions started coming up about on the Democratic side, when as Democrats, we're supposed to stand up all the time and say we're proud supporters of public education. But we were looking at, data that showed in New York City, if you were a black male, it was not even a 1 in 10 shot that if you started high school as a freshman that you would graduate. So the groups started to wonder, how great is this public education system if we're looking at data like that? In this sort of gray area that existed between folks on the left and right starting to have conversations about what they had on their hands, a coalition emerged throughout the 90s, which really showed itself in 2001 at the federal level when No Child Left Behind law was passed. This was a law that in most of the country right now agrees is not a good thing. It's like the least popular law in the history of American public education. But what you saw was a coalition of liberal Democrats like Senator Ted Kennedy and Congressman excuse me one second. Congressman Miller, I'm forgetting his first name right now, from California, teaming up with Republicans like John Boehner and George W. Bush to sort of form what became a coalition of folks who were pushing for school choice and pushing for school accountability to sort of bring them together. I've been talking a lot about this lately. When you look at the No Child Left Behind law itself, you can see elements where the negotiations took place. You can see where the choice people got something, and you can see where the accountability people got something, and you can see where they tried to tie accountability and choice together. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't, but it was sort of the nature of coalition building. It represented a moment for bipartisan work in Washington that I think a lot of people still find hard to understand. So you saw President Bush working with groups like the NAACP, National Council of La Raza, groups representing civil rights groups that were intent upon making sure that we were shining a spotlight on all aspects of the public education system, including disaggregating student test data by race and by income level. Something which was not immediately popular with a lot of school districts around the country, but which helped a lot of civil rights groups establish the data points that they needed to even argue that there was a problem and that some students were not being served as well as they could be. The perception still, while there was a lot of work being done between Democrats and Republicans in Washington on this issue, was that it was still kind of a Republican thing, primarily because President Bush was a Republican. And teacher unions were still teacher unions. They built an impressive infrastructure to influence politics at the federal level and in states and local districts. That changed pretty dramatically. That perception changed in 2008 with the primary election on the Democratic side of the aisle. If you remember, a lot of teacher unions around the country placed their bets on Hillary Clinton becoming the next president back in 2008. The American Federation of Teachers went all in for Senator Clinton when she was running. And there were groups of the local unions from the National Education Association were very active in trying to take Barack Obama off the ballot in the primary. In Nevada, after the casino workers union endorsed Obama, the National Education Association was part of a lawsuit that was trying to prevent casinos from being polling places in that election. So this is when I'm talking about the gray area. This is something that a lot of the world up here didn't really notice what was happening, but there was a scrum taking place within the Democratic Party. At the same time, you saw candidate Obama put together the most incredible fundraising apparatus that Democratic Party had ever seen. In fact, it got to a point where he didn't even really need the Democratic Party because he was raising so much money on his own that the infrastructure that the National Party usually puts into place, it was sort of irrelevant to Obama. In Denver at the 2008 Democratic Convention, if you remember, President Obama gave his acceptance speech in an open-air stadium outside in Denver. He didn't even show up in the convention area where the Democratic Party was doing its thing for several days leading up to that point. And the message that was being sent within the party and with part of this scrum was that at that moment, the Democratic Party needed Barack Obama more than Barack Obama needed the Democratic Party. And in some ways, the infrastructure that teacher unions had built that had sustained the Democratic Party for years were less important to this candidate running for office. So my point is not to sort of dive into the inside baseball too much, but to suggest that in 2008, what we saw was a Democrat get elected president of the United States with a level of independence that we don't normally see on education issues from Democratic candidates. It allowed Obama to sort of engage in what a lot of people called a Nixon goes to China type moment, where you saw a Democratic president stand up and talk a different game about education. And the politics of that were enormous. I remember the day early on in 2009 when they were talking about the race to the top, and a reporter asked President Obama whether he thought teachers should be evaluated based on student performance. And up until that time, as you know, there was just a lot of hand-wringing. It was sort of like on the one hand this, on the other hand that, ton of gray area. Obama's answer was, of course they should be evaluated based on student performance. What else would they be evaluated on? To have the Democratic leader, the President of the United States offer that kind of answer sort of gave a green light for state legislatures and Democratic leaders all over the country to talk about education reform in a way that they hadn't before. And we saw in 2010 and 2011 many states with Democratic governors and Democratic legislatures take up education reform issues that had trouble getting any kind of traction in the years leading up to that. So we're at this moment right now where we've seen the Democratic Party around the country engage more actively in education reform. We've also seen, though, that because the green light for Democrats to engage has come from Washington and come from the Democratic president, that issues of federalism and the role that the federal government can or should play in education is popping up a lot and is becoming a more active part of the education reform discussion than I think we expected in the past. We've seen Democrats grappling with issues of state funding for public education, becoming to play a role in this and really affecting how much support they are willing to get behind reform efforts if there aren't resources to make reform happen. And we've seen on the Republican side some, what I would call as a partisan, I'll be clear that this is just my interpretation of it, some overreach on the part of Republican governors that have, Wisconsin in particular, that have engaged in attempts to limit or weaken collective bargaining, which were not attached to any broader discussion about education reform, and which in some ways sent the Democratic base in those states back to the corner that they had been in before, and one where Democrats became less willing to engage on some of the issues. We've been lucky in that, for those of us who care deeply about education reform, it's been a pretty sexy issue for a couple years. I have no idea how long that lasts. There's copies of my book that are here. The reason I wrote that book back in 2005 as a newspaper reporter, it was frustrating to me to sort of deal with the reality of our public schools on a daily basis and just generally encounter a public that didn't seem to care much about what was happening. Everybody says they care about education. Every poll shows it's one of the top issues. But when it comes down to really lifting a finger, we've generally got this problem in this country that people, they don't care. They'll take care of their kids. They'll make sure their kids are set. They worry about their taxes. They worry about all that stuff. But in terms of coming together as communities to say our schools need to be doing something different, it's a tough task to do that. We've had some pretty interesting energy on a bipartisan basis to try to make that happen. But I don't know how long that can last. My hope is we can stretch this a few more years and really move the needle and implement some change in public education so that it's ready, so that 50 years from now, a new group of reformers come around and reform our reforms. Because I think it's a regular continuum and continuous improvement. A couple factors that have made this thing more interesting for Democrats to deal with and sort of getting it into the public square for Democrats to embrace. The emergence of a group called Teach for America, which it's not a Democratic group, they exist to try to improve the pool of applicants for teacher jobs around the country. It has helped us. There is this sort of something in the DNA of that organization. I know they're not in this state, but it'd be intriguing if they ever came here to watch this play out. Their starting point is that there is a problem in education that needs fixing, but that it can be fixed. So there's this optimistic, we can do this sort of mentality that pervades it, which makes it an easier discussion for a lot of folks on the Democratic side to have. The growth of charter schools, public charter schools, also has been a huge factor on Democratic politics. And a lot of it comes down to, like Teach for America, sort of a positive proof point. People can see in their communities that things can be better and that there are different ways to run a school that are worth considering. But the reality on the politics is that there's a lot of folks who have joined boards of Teach for America and of charter schools around the country that wouldn't have been engaged before in the education discussion. And all of a sudden, it becomes a focus of their philanthropic efforts, their civic endeavors, and they start to really look at what's happening politically, and they start to see that a lot of the friends that they used to have in politics when they weren't involved in education are not remotely helpful when they need them to be helpful on education issues. And it sort of jump-started a lot of conversations, Democrat to Democrat, in communities all over this country about what are we going to be about as Democrats? We used to think that we stood up for the little guys. And I'd like to think that we can get back there again. Again, I'm not trying to convert anyone, just trying to give one guy's impression on where this has all gone. I'm just going to stop there, and I'd love to dive into any questions that you all have, or even field any comments or pushback that you have on any of these theories. There is in the little bit of time that I've spent here in Boise, well, I'll get to this one issue first, because I know the question is going to come up about my impressions of Idaho relative to other states. And one thing that I would just point out, and take it for whatever it's worth, for most of the rest of the country, the debate about whether or not things need to change, it's long over. I still, here though, I find that there's still people that want to challenge the notion that anything needs to change at all. So that's something for you guys to grapple with. And maybe you'll conclude that everything is hunky-dory and you don't need to change. And that'll affect the politics in a different way. But that debate, just about every place else, is long gone. So thank you for your attention and coming out here today.
Thank you, Joe. We're actually going to do something a little bit different than the last sessions, if you were with us then. We're going to give you all maybe about 5 or so minutes to kind of talk as a table over what you heard and what maybe come up with a question as a table. And you're certainly more than welcome to come up with more than one question, but we just want you all to talk amongst yourselves as to what Joe had to say. And then in about 5 minutes or so, we'll start answering those questions to Joe. And you can write them again. They're the little cards on your tables. You can, once you've kind of got a question in mind, you can raise them in the air, and we've got people that will come around and grab those. So. Okay, I hate to interrupt because I'm hearing some great conversations, and I think this was a fun change from the last session that we had. So I will start reading the questions that you've submitted to Joe. Are you ready, Joe? Okay. First one, in the few days that you have been on the ground in Idaho, what visible signs have you seen that we are behind the curve?
It's a good question, and I don't want to claim to have done a scientific survey or jumped into the data too much. And because I work in politics, I'm more interested in the conversations and the feelings, the perceptions that things are either pointed in the right direction or not. When I was here a month ago at a breakfast to kick off the legislative session, I made a comment about how the debate about the need to change schools had been settled, and I didn't clarify by saying the rest of the country, because a number of people came up to me afterward and said, no, that debate is still very much in play here. So that's basically what I'm basing that comment on, was a lot of the feedback I've gotten on that one particular remark.
Okay, next question. Given we are now recovering from the recession, what happens to reform? Do we risk going back to the same old system? How do we prevent that?
There is a huge risk that we go back to the same old system, and there is something interesting about what the pressure that comes from hard economic times can make you do in terms of rethinking all the operations. If, as the economy improves, we just start pouring money back in without the same commitment to thinking about how we're spending it, I don't think taxpayers are going to be very pleased. Arne Duncan, the Education Secretary, was calling it the new normal. He was urging people to embrace the new normal, which was finding better ways to do what we used to do before with less money than we had. The worry would be that the new normal gets thrown away, and as times the economic conditions improve, we lose the commitment to trying to really dig down and find better ways to do things.
What are the structural components that need to change?
I think a lot of what we've seen around the country in the last couple of years around teacher evaluations in particular were important, not because the evaluations themselves are so important, but because you needed to begin the process of injecting quality into the discussion about the practice of public education. I think we were sort of got there for a bit with students. We're very happy to test kids and find out what whether they're making progress and moving along the lines. But we've been less reluctant to talk about what's working and what's not working. And the idea of teacher evaluations, aside from the mechanics of doing teacher evaluations, but moving to a point where we can recognize that some teachers are great. And right now it's hard to have that conversation if you're supposed to believe that everybody's performing at the same level. The idea that for most of the country, for the last 100 years, teacher evaluations, the best you could get was a satisfactory teacher. You were either satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And if you have kids in the schools, you'd like for better than satisfactory. You'd at least want a commitment to trying to get better than satisfactory. And I think that those kind of elements to recognize that some things are working better than others. We need to start celebrating success and having honest conversations about failure. And I think those are the kind of things that I think structurally are really important, more so in the big picture than any of the small pieces. Teacher evaluations unto themselves are not that big a deal, but when looked at in the broader context about really striving for an excellent public school system filled with excellent teachers in front of every child is a much different conversation.
Okay, let me just interject here. If you happen to be tweeting right now, we do have a hashtag, it's #EdSession, so I just want to encourage that as well. Okay, next question, Joe. Share with us the state or states that you believe Idaho could most learn from, most similar to us.
I think Colorado is a state where we've done a lot of work where there are some lessons to be learned. in terms of the makeup of the student population, but also sort of the engagement of the civic community, business leaders, political establishment in raising the bar of the conversation so that you can begin to have really productive discussions about results. But Colorado as a state has been willing to rethink a lot of things that were just sort of considered ingrained in the public education, including how teachers are compensated, sort of front-loading the salary schedule so that teachers can earn more at the front end rather than having to wait 20 years to get to the payout. And really taking a lot of interesting steps on pushing not just teacher accountability but teacher evaluations, but school leader principal accountability and evaluations, and sort of banking off some of those discussions about, if you're going to hold principals accountable, what are really the tools that we should consider fair game for principals to have if their jobs are going to be on the line for performance. But Colorado, it's an interesting place, easy to fly to from here, so you should all.
Next question, how do you raise the level of discourse so that the bitter accusations, such as you hate teachers, are stopped and that we can move forward?
I think events like this, where you can bring people together and sort of agree to disagree and agree that continuous improvement, this concept, is something that drives schools all over the rest of the globe. And in that, for some reason, it's slightly perverse that we look down on that concept in public education. But creating a comfort level among everyone, including parents and teachers and students, that if we're going to be about great public schools, we got to be thinking about continuously making them better, like every other sector is doing.
What is the vision of Race to the Top, and how does it work to meet the needs of all children?
So the vision of Race to the Top, and I'll give you like a crass political answer for a second. If you remember in the stimulus package that was passed in Washington back in early 2009, in the first days of the Obama administration, there was $100 billion that was allocated to public education. $100 billion in the stimulus package alone. So forget about the normal federal funding for education. The sort of political deal that was on the table was, of that $100 million, we basically were saying to the public education lobby, you can have the 95, but 5 has to be reserved for reform, for creating incentives to try to do different things. So that $5 billion became the Race to the Top competition. And mindful of the fact that there are people that don't like the federal government ordering states to do things, and we learned through No Child Left Behind that if the federal government tells states to do things and the states don't feel like doing them, there's really not a lot the federal government can do to put you under double secret probation or something. But so the idea was create a pot of money for incentives to say to the states, you're not going to make you do this, but if you want to get some of this money, here's some of the things that are non-negotiables that you need to be willing to do. It just so happened that that was taking place at a time when state budgets all over the country were severely strapped for dollars, and they were willing to launch some conversations about changing policies that they hadn't been willing to do before. So I've always thought of it as a way to, for the federal government to incentivize policy changes at the state level. To claim that Race to the Top is going to affect individual classrooms, I don't think was ever a realistic expectation from the beginning.
Okay. Any suggestions of where Idaho moves from here? Integral elements of progress?
I'm intrigued with the potential for Idaho to be the national leader on figuring out the rural education issue and how we get to a point, not only improving rural education, but finding ways to make it more efficient at a time when it is tough for government to be able to afford all of this. As you saw in the video, a lot of places we've worked have been in urban areas on the Northeast. So I realize when I come to a place like Idaho that a lot of what I'm talking about, you may consider it totally irrelevant, but a lot of the national foundations and the federal government have been focused a lot on urban education. And in some ways, it's because those were the first parts of the country to end the debate about whether change was needed. I mean, it was obvious to people in a lot of those cities that change needed to happen. But there's not as much attention given to figuring out what the next 50 years of rural education look like and what kind of innovations can be unleashed to make it a great deal for rural students and for taxpayers. And I think you guys are ripe for leading the country on that.
We still doing okay on time, Blossom? Yep, okay. Next question. Your kids go to Boston Latin. What do you see as the positive aspects of that school that should be duplicated? It's a large urban high school seeing success, right?
All right, so it's Brooklyn Latin that my son goes to, but it's
okay.
modeled on Boston Latin. So that is the, let me just take a step back. My oldest son goes to a very large high school in Brooklyn, New York, called Brooklyn Tech. It's a 5,000 student high school, 5,000 highly motivated students, which helps, but it is a 5,000 student monstrosity where basically every kid in the freshman class falls through the cracks and you don't find them until the second semester, sophomore year, and then they're, oh yeah, you're a student here. My youngest son is the total opposite experience. He is at a school called Brooklyn Latin. Only a couple hundred students. It's fairly new. It's only been in existence for a couple years. Created as a part of the wave of small schools. It's a small school within a larger school. It's modeled on Boston Latin. The kids have to take Latin for 4 years. They wear uniforms. They're on a field trip up to Boston Latin today, the freshman class up there. And I think the thing that makes it most special and that we're enthusiastic about it, it's less about the Latin and the uniform and modeling it on this other school, but it is a great principal that has been able to select his teachers who work in that building. And they're all on the same team. They in the summertime, they got a grant to bring the incoming freshmen to go on a camping trip for 3 days so that they could all get to know each other before school starts. And they're just like, they're on the ball. And it's a great group of educators working with a principal. They have to follow the traditional United Federation of Teachers teacher contract going forward, but they were able to select their staff at the front end. And the question is going to be, 10 years in, when teachers start to leave and you've got to start replacing teachers through the more traditional method of moving teachers around in New York City, whether you can keep that environment intact. But it's a fascinating experience. I was telling someone earlier today, in New York City, we have some of the best public schools anywhere. We also have some of the worst public schools anywhere, and that's sort of the rub. And unfortunately, for many years, if you lived in the neighborhoods that were the most expensive neighborhoods in New York City, that's where the great public schools lined up. So the battle has been about expanding access to kids who aren't able to live in the best neighborhoods.
Can you give an example of Democrats leading reform in a state? For instance, did the Democrat in the video from Indianapolis support the ed reform in Indiana?
Yes, although there's a sort of sad story about the Indiana situation. She was supportive. Since that video was made last summer, she ran for state senate and lost. And the teachers union in Indiana endorsed her Republican opponent, who was a voucher supporter. They really wanted to send a message that as a Democrat you weren't supposed to do this. So I don't want to make it sound like everything is peachy. We got plenty of work to do to protect some of the people that do that. But in a state like Colorado, which I do encourage you guys to take a look at, when they passed their famous Senate Bill 191 several years ago, that was a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic governor that got that done. And it's a lot of what they passed and were championed by all Democratic leaders there was part of your education reform package here.
Okay. How is Dems for ed reform philosophy different and similar to the philosophies held by prominent Republicans for ed reform, like Jeb Bush or Tom Luna?
I think, and so we always joke that people call Democrats for education reform defer, that the Republicans for education reform are reefer, which some people think it's funny, other people don't. But I think there's a lot of overlap between how Democrats for education reform and Republicans that embrace education reform. I think sometimes the language is different. On school choice issues, for example, we find a lot of our Republican partners on things talking about freedom, where our folks tend to talk more about opportunities. And on issues of funding, it's a lot of, there are often divisions. I mean, our starting point is that it costs money to run good schools, and that, you know, if you need any proof of that, just watch what rich people are willing to do for their kids. So I've done work in states where we've had a Republican governor pushing an aggressive education reform agenda, not getting much traction from Democrats in the House and Senate, because at the same time they were being asked to support education reform, their budgets to their districts were being cut at the state level. And sort of went back and said to the governor's office in this one particular state, I think we could get a deal done if you put some money on the table, and the governor didn't want to do that. So and I tend to think of this in terms of deal making, and a lot of times the deal comes down to money in exchange for reform. That it's hard to do a lot of reform if there's not an opportunity to fund something.
Is DFER involved in any rural states or rural areas? It seems like most of your members, Democrats, are energized about education reform only in urban areas. How can we get Democrats energized to reform or improve education in rural or suburban areas too?
So, and this is the knock on us, is that we tend to gravitate our work around urban areas. Like I said, I was just in Georgia the other day, and we were meeting with a lot of folks in Atlanta, and it was pointed out over and over that the discussion in Atlanta is very different than the rest of rural Georgia. I think, you know, we're interested in trying to figure this out, so I'm hoping that Idaho can sort of lead the way on figuring out the rural issue, and we can look back to figure out what that conversation is. I mean, we're not there yet. We're not equipped to be able to deal with rural issues, because it's not the world that most of us live in that are doing this work for our organization. It is very apparent to us that it's an area we need to attack.
Okay. I'm having trouble reading this one, but I believe they're saying, what underlies your statement that Idaho has not yet come to the conclusion that reform in education is needed? We're not sure we agree with that statement.
Yeah,
so
and,
what do you
maybe,
mean by that?
So maybe Idaho does believe that we need major changes in education. I didn't get the sense, I get the sense that there's still pushback on that. And I could be wrong, and I apologize if I was reading the sentiments wrong. But like I said, I made that comment at the legislative breakfast a month ago that the argument was over, and I got a lot of pushback from it.
Okay. What is school choice? What would someone else describe it as who doesn't agree with you?
It's a good question. We were participated in the National School Choice Week, which ended over the weekend. We've talked about school choice as a way to enable parents to choose from among publicly accountable schools. And I think there's a rub, I think, to go back to the question about how we differ sometimes with Republicans on this issue, is that we have partnered with Republicans on school choice issues that believe that the marketplace should be able to, the marketplace itself is a level of accountability, that parents will choose the best schools for their kids at the end of the day. And I don't mean this to sound like a knock on parents, but I think we've seen in enough places where there are healthy school choice programs that there is a role for government accountability and transparency, and at least letting parents know what their choices really come down to. What was the second part of the question?
What is school choice? What would someone else describe it as who doesn't agree with you?
Look, I think that the most traction against school choice has come from people who argue that allowing parents to choose good schools for their kids takes money away from the bad schools and makes it difficult to reform the bad schools.
Okay. So a reminder, we're streaming online, so this is a Facebook question.
Great.
Mr. Williams, you talked a lot about teachers' unions. How do you or do you feel they play a part in education reform?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. It's different state by state, city by city, and at the national level. Teachers' unions have to play a role in education reform, and they represent teachers. The teacher voice needs to be involved. I think personally and through our organization, we've just believed that they shouldn't be the only voice that gets to play a role, particularly in how they influence the Democratic Party's stances on education reform. I can tell you in places where we've done some tough legislation where teacher unions were opposing us, it would have been helpful to have them in the room negotiating the deals rather than having them just saying no on the outside, because when teacher unions decide to just fight reform and no is the only answer, it means teachers don't have a voice when the final decisions are made. And I think it is crucial to have the voice in there. So I think the most pragmatic union members around the country sort of recognize when the wind is blowing and make sure that they are in the room so that teachers aren't left out when important decisions are made. And my hope is that we can get to a point where teachers start demanding that of their teacher union leaders and say, look, we don't want you just to say no. Get in there and come back to us and tell us for real what's good, what's bad, what needs to be changed, but don't just say no because it's about power.
Okay. How do you hold a teacher or student accountable for performance when you don't support their methods of teaching or learning that may be different than the traditional teaching to the test?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, other than I think most good accountability systems leave some room for judgment. And you know, any good government program has a waiver process, and there ought to be ways to allow innovation to take place while still respecting the idea of accountability somehow. And whether it's the state coming up with sort of side agreements about how they will hold different schools and teachers accountable if they want to try something different. But I think a lot of that comes down to how you charter and enable schools to form in the first place.
Okay. Is it a question of money? What is the reason people take one side or the other on reform?
Is that two different questions?
It's on one card.
So, I mean, I do think that money matters, and the charter schools that I talked to some charter school people in this state when I was here last about. You know, I'm actually astonished that charter schools are able to survive in this state with the low level of funding that they get. It's interesting hearing, working with folks on the East Coast who got involved in charter schools, who maybe, I think when they started out thinking that money wasn't the issue, and then they sort of evolved to a point where they started to see that how you spend money can be an issue if you're spending it right, and that once you feel like you're spending it right, then money is the issue. You need more of it so that you can serve more kids and do more. So I do think money is an issue. What was the second part of that one?
And what is the reason people take one side or the other on reform?
Yeah, I think because I think the black and white aspect that I referred to before is it's a lot easier to deal with than trying to figure out where the gray area is. And unfortunately, it's getting people to accept that the gray area can be a fun place to hang out. That's where we're going to get stuff done, no matter what state we're talking about.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So please join me in giving Joe Williams a round of applause. We did have a handful of questions, obviously, that we weren't able to get to, so we are going to make Joe stick around after everyone's left, and we're going to stick a camera in front of him and make him answer these questions, and we'll also post those answers for you online at the edsessions.org. And if you're still thinking of a question that you would like Joe to answer, there are cards on the table, and please leave them in the baskets on your table, and we'll gather those up. Next month's speaker is Andy Smerick, who is a partner at Bellwether Education Partners, a nonprofit organization working to improve educational outcomes for low-income students. His book on overhauling the delivery of inner-city public education, The Urban School System of the Future, was released in 2012, and his articles have appeared in the Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, Boston Globe, Education Next, National Affairs, and other outlets. Andy's topic in March, today's education reforms, what they might mean for Idaho. So we do hope to see you all next month. Thank you those who have joined us via the internet on the video cast. A recording of today's presentation will be up on the Ed Sessions website. That is the edsessions.org and the Ed Sessions Facebook site later today. And again, please leave your feedback cards on the baskets on your table. One quick reminder and a thank you to our partners, KTVB, Idaho Technology Council, Idaho State Board of Education, Idaho Association of School Administrators, Idaho Business for Education, and Idaho School Boards Association. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next month.